What's going on, people? Today we're breaking down the final ever episode of Attack on Titan in hopefully around 40 minutes or less. Along the way, I'll be explaining certain key moments, character motivations, small details you might have missed, and just my overall thoughts on the ending itself. Just before we dive into it though, I should mention that one of my upcoming videos is a full, updated recap of the alternate timeline where Eren got the Colossal Titan. So if you don't want to miss that, then remember to smash that sub button with notifications on. Alright, so the final episode of Attack on Titan began with a flashback to 2000 years ago, when Ymir was still just a slave for the Eldian tribe. At that moment in time, she had no Titan powers and no hope of escape, and there are two key reasons why this scene is important. Reason number one is that it gave us a rare insight into Ymir's motivations, specifically her feelings about freedom itself. Earlier this season, we know that she initially had a pretty peaceful existence that was brutally taken away from her, and ever since then she's had no control over her own life. However, as she stared at the pigs in this scene, we see her come to the realization that although she can't attain freedom for herself, in this specific moment she at least had the power to grant freedom to something else. Despite the obvious risk involved, Ymir freed these pigs simply because she had the chance to do it. And that's why it's so interesting that when she had the chance to be free in this moment and in this moment, on both occasions she chose to remain as a slave. This leads us to the all-important question: why is it that someone who clearly values freedom would willingly deny that same freedom for herself? Zeke theorized that it's because there's something Ymir couldn't let go of, and Eren confirmed that that thing was the love she had for King Fritz. Now, this topic is definitely one of the stranger elements of the series, but in my opinion, the anime did a slightly better job of conveying why it happened in the first place. When we look at the manga version, we see that Ymir's fascination with love, it began when she saw this random couple getting married, and from the way the chapter was drawn, to me there was never anything about this couple that really stood out. However, when rewatching her backstory in the anime, it finally became clear to me that yeah, this wasn't just any random person. When you look at the nose, facial hair, forehead wrinkles, and pretty much everything, this is clearly King Fritz, or I guess he was Chief Fritz at the time. You might be wondering though, why would it even matter if this was Fritz? And to answer that question, we have to look at things from Ymir's perspective. On the day her village was massacred, Fritz was the one who led that operation. So from her point of view, this guy is just, a cruel and violent person. To then witness that same evil human displaying this kind of gentleness and affection, it would understandably be a huge shock, and it showed that when love is involved, even a savage like him can treat people nicely. On top of that, the wedding itself was an example of what happiness looks like, which is something that Ymir likely aspired to have. As a slave who had no happiness, no family, and nowhere to go even if she did somehow escape, King Fritz's love was the only thing in her mind that could potentially give her that happy life. That's the sole reason why she returned to him even after achieving the power of the Titans, since she thought that by being useful to him, he'd eventually show her the same affection she saw from him on that day. Of course, as we all know, he never viewed her as anything more than just his slave, but it was her desire to experience this affection from Fritz that kept her loyal to him even after her own death. We'll talk more about her mindset towards the end of the video, but for now, the main reason why this scene was significant is that it showed us that she's always valued freedom from the beginning, and that it's the curse of love that kept her trapped in past for 2000 years. Also, the second reason why it matters is that this is just a great example of the butterfly effect, given that immediately after she freed the pigs, the episode abruptly flashes forward to her standing on Eren's founding titan. For me, this contrast worked incredibly well since it was directly showing us how a seemingly minor decision from 2000 years ago has led to this insane series of events where now all life on Earth is getting trampled. Moving on to the Alliance, after Reiner destroyed the fake Beast Titan in part 3, the group now realized that finding Zeke inside this massive pile of bones is virtually impossible. As a result, the quickest option to stop the rumbling would be to kill Eren himself, or at the very least blow his Titan to pieces, and this is where the Colossal Titan comes in. As Armin struggled with the idea of using his explosive power against his best friend, he thinks to himself, those who can't abandon anything can't change anything. This was a direct reference to something he previously said about Erwin in season 1, because at the time, the old commander he'd effectively sacrificed hundreds of scouts in his plan to capture the female Titan, and although not everyone was cool with that, Armin said that to change the world, you have to be willing to sacrifice things that you care about. Given that Armin himself is now commander of the scouts, and given that he's alive in Erwin's place, this is the moment where he's kind of stepping into that type of role and beginning to accept that this might end with Eren not surviving. What I loved about this whole moment is that throughout the entire episode, in fact, every time someone alluded to the possibility of Eren dying, Mikasa's reaction was always consistent. Like, it was very clear that she was never on board with taking things that far, which is one example of the parallels between Mikasa and Ymir. At the end of the day, these are two characters who are both in love with genocidal maniacs, and who would usually put their lives on the line to defend that maniac regardless of the situation. That being said, in a perfect world, Ymir would have had the courage to let King Fritz die on the day he was nearly assassinated, but instead her love for him meant that she didn't have the strength to let it happen. By comparison, Mikasa is in a very similar situation in that the person she loves is being targeted by other people, and just like Ymir, it's ultimately her decision whether he lives or dies. What Ymir wanted to see is someone who would make the difficult choice that she wasn't able to, and in the process, demonstrate that being in love doesn't necessarily mean being subservient to that person. However, in order to reach this endpoint, Ymir puts pressure on the Alliance by summoning an army of ancient titans. As the name suggests, these are titan shifters from the past, some of whom you would have to assume were in the Great Titan War, and there were a few designs here that I just wanted to highlight. Easily the best looking one, for me at least, was the Robocop Warhammer Titan that ended up getting pummeled by Reiner. But besides that, the Jaw Titan with the rectangular eye slots and the giant Deer Beast Titan, they were in my top 5. But it's just a shame we couldn't see more of the creatures shown in the opening for season 2. I think that would have been the perfect payoff. Although, to be fair, I don't think Reiner would stand much chance against a freaking T-Rex. Now, before we explain what's going on with Armin, a quick word from today's sponsor, War Thunder, the free online game available on PlayStation, Xbox, and PC. When it comes to vehicle combat, War Thunder offers easily the most complete experience ever, proven by the selection of over 2,000 tanks, planes, helicopters, and warships. Personally, one of my favorite things about this game when playing it on PlayStation was aerial combat, in particular the hyper-realistic damage models that come with it. Of course, every vehicle in the game is incredibly detailed by default, but there are still a wide range of customization options, including skins, 3D decorations, and these anime-inspired body pillows. To play War Thunder for free on PC or consoles, be sure to click the link in my description and you'll be able to claim all of these free bonuses that you can see on screen. And if you're a new player or even an existing player who hasn't played for 6 months or more, you'll be able to claim all of these free bonuses. Now, pretty soon after the Ancient Titans appeared, Armin gets violated by the Okapi Titan, which is a type of animal I think most of us probably wouldn't know about if it wasn't for this show. And by swallowing him like this, it was a very calculated move by Ymir. Moments earlier, Armin told the rest of the Alliance to get away as he was planning to blow the place up, and so by kidnapping him like this, it forced the rest of them to stick around and try and fight to get him back. When it comes to Pieck though, you have to respect that she really didn't want the hassle, and early on she tries to avoid a big battle by just killing Eren with dynamite. Sadly for her, she got stopped by the ghost of Lara Taiba, and from that point onwards, the Alliance really did struggle against this onslaught of ancient titans. During the chaos, we did get this heartfelt moment where Jean still acknowledges Reiner as a member of the Scouts, and to me this was significant because even in previous seasons when they were trying to kill each other, there were a few times where it was kind of obvious that deep down, Jean secretly did still care about him. Now, that doesn't mean by itself that he forgives Reiner for the things he did, but it does show you that the years they spent together wasn't just forgotten after the Warriors betrayed them, and I guess this was him finally admitting that to his face. Regardless, with the exception of Mikasa, things weren't looking too good for the Alliance until Falco swoops in to save them with his flying titan. His ability to fly in this finale shouldn't have been too much of a surprise for everyone, considering the dreams he was having in part 3, but there were still a few small details that suddenly became relevant in this moment. For example, in episode 19 of the final season, when Eren is entering the past dimension, he sees a vision of Falco's Titan soaring towards Fort Salta, which is where this final battle is taking place. In hindsight, we can now say that this vision was a memory from the future, and speaking of future memories, the next small detail comes straight from episode 1 of this season. Shortly after we were introduced to Falco for the first time, he wakes up from a dream in which he says he was flying around with a sword while there were also titans nearby. That line about flying around with a sword was a bonus detail that was specifically added for the anime, but it was never in the manga, and it was directly hinting at this final battle where you have a bunch of titans, a bunch of people with swords, and a flying Falco literally carrying them on his back. Finally, the third Easter egg that was relevant to this came in episode 2 of the final season, where General Calvi made a throwaway comment about how the Malian army could use a titan with wings. Moving on, with Falco, Annie, and Gabby arriving at Fort Salta, the Alliance then splits into separate teams, with one team having the job of saving Armin, while the other had the job of blowing up Eren's neck. By this point, the entire group, except Mikasa, had reluctantly accepted that to stop the rumbling, Eren has to die, otherwise everything they've done up until now would be for nothing. Technically speaking, there was also a third team here consisting of Levi, who was injured, and Gabby, whose main superpower is of course her 100% accuracy. As we already know, the captain's main aim in being here was to fulfill his promise to Erwin by killing Zeke, and the irony of the situation is that 2 times in the past, Levi could have easily done it. Like, this isn't a skill issue for him, it's just that on both occasions he wanted to preserve the Beast Titan so that someone on the island could steal his power. The problem now with this third attempt to kill Zeke is that after he was absorbed by the source of all living matter, his body became a physical part of the founding Titan, making him undetectable unless he chooses to reveal himself. In a second, we'll talk more about Zeke and his mental state, but first, Armin was busy having a breakdown inside of the past dimension. One of the things I thought was funny about this scene was the huge contrast between his opinion and the captain's opinion on who should have been brought back to life and turned into the Colossal Titan. Just a couple minutes earlier in the episode, Levi made a comment that he had no regrets about entrusting the future to Armin, which may have been a reference to when he initially gave Armin the injection and told him not to make him regret it. On the flip side, Armin has said in the past that it was definitely the wrong choice, and in this scene he echoes that same sentiment, believing that he hasn't repaid the second life he's been given. After calming down though, he does eventually realize that he's in the past dimension, and eventually finds Zeke quietly building a sandcastle. This is what brings us to Zeke's mental state, because from the beginning, he always believed that the existence of Eldians was pointless, since around the world all they do is experience suffering or just cause suffering to others in the form of titans. In his mind, everyone would be better off if subjects of Ymir were just never born again, and this ideology formed the entire basis of his euthanization plan. However, when Ymir turned her back on him and joined up with Eren instead, it sent Zeke into this depressed state where now it seems like he's given up on the rest of humanity as well, not just Eldians. From his new perspective, all life is effectively meaningless, since from the beginning of time, the goal of life has only been to survive and to multiply. The biggest proof of this is the source of all living matter itself, since although it can't seem to reproduce, it uses other living things to do the job on its behalf. An example of what I mean by this is how, even when Ymir died, the creature still managed to survive by attaching itself to her descendants, and in turn the number of titans kept multiplying. That's why in the present day, there are millions of Eldians around the world who, in the right circumstances, can be used as its own personal army, and this was all done in the name of survival. Zeke's point was that being driven by this instinct to survive and multiply is meaningless, and that it's time to let go of this natural instinct to survive that seems to motivate a lot of the things we do on a day-to-day basis. On the flip side, Armin's belief is that life is given meaning by the small trivial moments that we sometimes enjoy, and if you're an anime only, I want you to know that you were robbed of this flashback of him feeding this tiny squirrel. Anyhow, within the past dimension, Armin finds this leaf in the sand, and throughout the episode, this object kept manifesting itself as different things to different people. In Armin's case, it appeared as a leaf because that symbolizes his most precious childhood memory of him racing Eren and Mikasa towards the tree on the hill. Conversely, for Zeke it appeared as a baseball since that represents the games of catch he used to play with Tom Sava, and despite having nothing to do with survival, that game did give meaning to his life as well. As a child, all Zeke wanted was for Grisha to show him a degree of fatherly attention like all the other kids, but instead all his dad cared about was turning him into the messiah of the Eldians. As a result, these games were the only time a father figure gave him the quality time that he wanted, and although catch by itself has no meaning, Zeke admits that he would have been happy playing it forever. Just by saying this, he's acknowledging Armin's perspective that there's more to life than just survival and multiplication. And this moment is when a bunch of dead characters suddenly reappear in parts. For the most part, you can understand why most of these characters are here, like the 3 former warriors obviously have a connection to Zeke and would be against the rumbling, but for Eren Kruger, I'm honestly not so sure. This is a man who, by his own admission, has killed thousands of Eldians throughout his life, and the only reason he took things that far was because he believed in the end it would lead to Eldia being restored. His goal, and the goal of the other restorationists, was to take back the Founding Titan, get revenge on Marley, and bring back the Eldian Empire. So, however evil the rumbling might be, Eren Yeager is ticking all of those boxes. That's why, to me, I don't really see why Kruger would help stop the rumbling at all. Grisha is slightly different given that he already said he didn't support taking things this far, but Kruger, he's the guy who was taking things super far already. He was willingly sacrificing people to achieve this goal. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Like, I think all the other people here would help Armin and Zeke, but Kruger is the one I'm just like, you probably shouldn't be here. Now, one thing that's worth mentioning is that before this scene, we got a montage of Titans trampling different parts of the globe, and this was interesting because it gave us our first real look into other foreign countries besides Mali in the Middle East. In particular, we saw London, a couple of Asian cultures, including what is potentially Hizaru, not to mention they showed the Attack on Titan equivalent of the African continent. By zooming in here, you can see a group of tribespeople watching on as the rumbling approaches them, and scenes like this do help to humanize the rest of the world. For example, it's not like these tribespeople were any kind of threat to the island. In fact, like Historia said, most of these people don't have any idea why they're being killed. As an audience though, because we barely know any people outside of Mali, it can sometimes be difficult for us to empathize with characters who you never really see. That's why this montage was so important, because it demonstrates the reality of the situation, that the vast majority of people in the world are innocent and they don't really deserve this in the slightest. As a side note, one of the best creative choices of the finale was the whole black and white scene where only the mother and baby were colored in, and I can't take any credit for finding this Easter egg, but it does seem like the mother here who was falling off the cliff was the same woman that Eren saw back in Mali when she was pregnant. I think I just saw that on Twitter somewhere, so I thought I'd mention it, but yeah, that's a pretty amazing detail. Anyhow, back at Fort Salter, the Alliance was once again on the brink of getting wiped out until Bertolt and the other past Titans agreed to help stop the rumbling. Personally, I would have loved if these spirits had shown a little bit of personality instead of just staring blankly and never saying anything, because if you're Bertolt, you have to get at least a few hits on Armin before listening to what he has to say. Regardless, in the real world, the Titans rally together to protect the Alliance, and this shot of Kruger breaking the Armor Titan's back, this was great simply because he used the exact same finishing move as when he tore apart that Malian ship. On top of that, you had Tom Sava's Ram Beast Titan making its first appearance, and just like how Zeke's Titan form was inspired by a childhood toy, Tom's Beast Titan form was inspired by one of his son's stuffed animals. A reasonable explanation for this is that we know Ymir is the one who designs these titans in the past dimension, and considering that she has full access to the memories of every Eldian, it's likely that she selects the design based on animals that have, some kind of emotional significance to that person. Obviously, this is just my theory or headcanon, whatever you want to call it, but I do think it makes a lot of sense. Moving on, there was a moment where Gabby and Mikasa combined to free Armin from inside the Okapi Titan, while Zeke showed off his brand new cheeks made from Titan hardening. In this sequence, the Beast Titan was offering himself up as a sacrifice to stop the rumbling, because it was already established that Eren can't continue this massacre if he doesn't maintain contact with a Titan of royal blood. Having now realized that life isn't just a pointless game of survival and multiplication, he takes a quick second to appreciate the weather, because after his talk with Armin, I guess he learned to appreciate the smaller things in life that he was taking for granted. That being said, his new perspective doesn't last for long as Captain Levi swoops in to decapitate him, and it is ironic how when the moment finally came of the captain killing Zeke, the two of them were genuinely on the same side here. Every time they clashed before, there was obviously huge differences in what they were trying to achieve and what they were fighting for, but in this case, they share that overarching goal of stopping Eren. Of course, for Levi, he gets the added bonus of fulfilling the promise he made to Irvin, and by killing Zeke, all of the Wolf Titans around the world immediately come to a stop. technically speaking, you can argue this is a plot hole, given that back in season 2, Eren was able to temporarily control an army of titans even after Fritz was killed. And so if we follow that exact same logic, then he should have been able to continue the rumbling at least for a little bit after Zeke's death, because, you know, that power of the founding titan, it lingers for a little bit longer. However, a counterpoint to this is that I think we can all agree that if Ymir wants the rumbling to stop, then it's going to stop. And by her allowing Zeke to switch sides, which is what she did, she let it happen, it clearly shows that this is how she wants the events to play out. When the Beast Titan died, if we're being fully logical, then yeah, maybe Eren could have kept the Titans marching for a bit longer. But at the end of the day, Ymir's aim is to force Mikasa into a specific situation, and that situation only occurs when the rumbling stops here. Following the Titans coming to a standstill, Jean detonates the explosives around Eren's neck and, in the process, unleashes the source of all living matter. Just like when Gabi exposed this thing back in Shiganshina, it rushes forward trying to reconnect with Eren, and this frame right here is easily one of my favorites from the episode. Can you imagine trying to explain this image to someone who's just started season 1? Where would you even begin with this? Anyway, as the Alliance escapes on Falco's back, Armin detonates his nuke to blow away this pile of bones. This moment was especially notable for two reasons. The first being that at the exact same time it was happening, Historia was giving birth back on the island. In case you've never read the manga, this scene of her giving birth was meant to take place before the events of the final episode. So you have to wonder, why was it moved to the finale, and specifically, why was it placed right after Armin blows up the founder? There are several ways we can interpret this. For example, one explanation is that it's a tasteful reminder of how Historia's influence indirectly brought them to this point. 4 years ago, it was because of her that Eren first saw visions of the rumbling, and of course he had no idea whether that future was avoidable. Then, 2 years later, when the island was given an alternative to the rumbling, Eren had to reject that plan because it involved Historia and her future kids all being turned into Titan shifters. In his words, he didn't want her descendants to be bred and killed like livestock, and he didn't want her joining this cycle of kids eating their parents. In that sense, the birth of this child represents one of his main motivations for doing the rumbling, which is a future where Historia and her kids are freed from this responsibility. Another interpretation is that this moment is meant to be a contrast between life and death, because when Armin blew up the founding titan, he acknowledged there was a chance this could kill Eren, hence why he was saying goodbye. That being said, for plot reasons he was still alive, but before we get to that, there was a nice moment of the warriors being reunited with their parents. Up until now, they assumed their families had to be dead, since Liberia was trampled and it's not like Eldians are allowed to leave. So to find their parents here a million miles away in Fort Salta, it's gotta be one of the Hall of Fame coincidences, alongside Armin sitting right next to Annie in part 2. For the Grice family specifically, this reunion was a bit bittersweet since they found out that one of their kids is now a giant bird and the other one got evaporated back in Shiganshina, so yeah, not the best news. Meanwhile, off in the distance, Eren generates a brand new Titan body which combines with his original founding Titan head. Strategically speaking, turning into a Colossal was his best option to fight against Armin, because we've already seen how badly his regular Titan form compares to a shifter of this size. At the same time, the source of all living matter only had one aim, which was to survive, and to do that it obviously needs to reconnect with its host body. In fact, Gabi even says right here that the rumbling might start again if Eren makes contact with this giant worm, which was an interesting thing to say considering that when the rumbling stopped, Eren was already in contact with the worm and it didn't make a difference. So I think what this shows us is that without Zeke, there is pretty much nothing that would have restarted the rumbling, but it was still necessary for the Alliance to believe there was a chance. Otherwise, why would Mikasa kill him? For that reason, it was also necessary for Eren to keep fighting against them, because if he had just peacefully stayed inside of his Titan head, then in all likelihood the Alliance would have left it alone, and in the worst case scenario they would have killed the source of all living matter, or they would have tried to. In that sense, you can understand how all of this, everything that's going on right now, is basically just theatre. It's Eren and Ymir going through the motions, all to manipulate other people into taking certain actions. It's partly why later in the finale, he admits to Armin that he's a slave to freedom, because for the longest time he's been going through the motions, also that the future he saw would eventually happen. Now, like I was saying, the source of all living matter desperately wanted to reconnect with Eren, but in this case, Reiner was standing between them. To deal with him, the worm releases a gas similar to the gas that Zeke used in Raguko, and this substance was meant to turn every Eldian in Fort Salta into a pure Titan. The only Eldians who were immune from this were either Ackermans or Titan shifters, which meant that Gabby, Connie, and Jean were among the victims. Honestly, this would have been the perfect send-off for these characters. Not that I wanted them to die, but if their journey had ended here, it would have remained as like a permanent Goosebumps moment that had lasting consequences. A couple of details I want to mention is that as they're about to transform, Connie jokingly mentions that this is all Jean's fault because in season 1, it was him who influenced everyone to join the scouts. Up until then, he'd been pretty dead set on having a cushy life in the military police, but Marco believed that Jean could be a leader on the actual battlefield. On the night they then cremated Marco's corpse, his death had a huge impact on Jean's decision to join the scouts, and by extension it brought him and Connie to this moment. The second detail about this scene that might have been easy to miss is that as the smoke fills up Fort Salta, Annie's dad was specifically asked if he hurt his leg. If we look into Annie's backstory, she was the one who gave him this lifelong injury, and what's funny is that moments after he's asked this question, she appears in front of him for the first time in 9 years. Unfortunately, the reunion gets interrupted when all of the normie Eldians get titanized, leading us to one of the best moments in the entire finale. This scene of the warriors all crying and screaming as they're mobbed by Titan versions of their own parents, there was a level of like chaos and hopelessness here that really did feel like the end of the world. What follows this is arguably the most confusing sequence of the episode, so let's break it down step by step to understand what's going on. Firstly, if we flash back to when the Alliance were traveling to Odaha, that time period is when Eren individually said goodbye to each of his friends. As you can see here, one of those friends was Armin, but he also separately had conversations with Connie, Jean, Reiner, and Annie that we never got to see. What's important here is that after each conversation, he erased each of their memories, knowing that once he eventually dies, the memories would likely return. However, when it comes to Mikasa, it was impossible to do things this way, since Grandpa Ackerman confirmed a long time ago that Ackermans can't have their memories erased. As a consequence, Eren had to wait until these final chaotic scenes to have a moment with her, and there's an interesting reason why he chose this environment. Although it's true that he never spoke to Mikasa when she was traveling to Odaha, at the very least, it seems like either Eren or Ymir were aware of what she was thinking at that time. The reason I say that is because when she was on the boat, Mikasa wondered to herself how her life would be different if she admitted her feelings for him during their first trip to Mali. On that trip, Eren was having a moral crisis inside of his own head, and when he asked her about her feelings for him, it's because in this moment, he was looking for a way out, an excuse to not follow the future he saw. If Mikasa had answered differently and not family zoned him, then this could have been their life, where they abandoned everything to spend his final 4 years in peace. Now, despite the fact that this didn't end up happening in the real world, the past dimension offered them a unique chance to experience it. Like we saw with Zeke, it is possible to spend what feels like years in here, even though only a few seconds have passed in reality, and there is evidence to suggest that this is what happens to Mikasa. For example, in this scene where she hugs Eren, she mentions how they previously agreed that they wouldn't speak about the day they ran away. Because she's an Ackerman, it's not like Eren could have altered her mind and, implanted some kind of fake conversation. Clearly, they did actually speak before. This confirms that they've been in paths for longer than what we see in this episode, with Eren outright saying that running away to the mountains was her idea. Assuming that's true, then they've been here in the past dimension for at least 2 months since this moment, with the past dimension offering Mikasa a chance to redo her decision. Whether they then spent 4 entire years in pause is definitely up for debate, but at the very least, they were here long enough for her to be happy about the situation. It's relevant to remember that just minutes earlier in the real world, Mikasa was super depressed because she thought that Eren had died and that their final conversation was him saying how much he hated her. To go from feeling like that to this, where they can spend all this time together in the past dimension as an actual romantic couple, this is what enabled her to get the closure she needed. One great thing about this entire sequence, besides the colossal fight which looked amazing, one great thing is the way Mikasa's consciousness flickered in between the dream and reality. The best example of this is when Eren tells her in pause to throw the scarf away once he dies, to which she replies in the real world by saying she can't do it. From Mikasa's point of view, the scarf represents her connection with Eren and her love for him, and the time they spent together in paths only solidified that feeling. Then, when she swoops in to decapitate him, it coincides with his death in the paths dimension, as in that reality 4 years had gone by and his body was shutting down due to the curse of Ymir. During the scene where he dies in the past dimension, you probably noticed that we've already seen this moment back in part 3. In case you may have forgotten, this scene in part 3 was a dream that young Eren had while sleeping under the tree. Once he wakes up from that dream, the first thing he says is, "What am I doing here?" followed by him revealing that he had a really long dream that he's now forgotten. One way of interpreting this is that Eren's consciousness is stuck in some kind of endless time loop in which he constantly relives his own traumatic life, or he just reincarnated as a seagull. Whichever you prefer, I honestly don't mind. Anyway, switching over to Ymir, after 2000 years, this is exactly what she wanted to see. By Mikasa refusing to let go of her love for Eren, but at the same time killing him for the greater good, it showed that you don't have to blindly obey someone just because you're in love with them. What Ymir wanted to know is that you can still love that person even if you reject what they tell you to do, and Mikasa's actions showed her that she's free to make her own decisions regardless of what she felt for King Fritz. On top of that, with Eren being dead, the source of all living matter didn't have a host body to return to, and so it vanishes up in smoke, although admittedly this was a lot clearer in the manga version where you actually see it disappearing. But yeah, after Eren's death it didn't have anywhere to go, and so it just died, I guess off screen. Consequently, with the source of all Titan powers being destroyed, and with Ymir being freed, the power of the Titans itself disappears from the world. That's why all the Titan shifters and pure Titans reverted back into their human form, with the only exception to this being the Wall Titans, who I guess we can assume just were never humans in the first place. Either that, or you have a bunch of naked people hiding behind all this smoke. I mean, why would they be naked? I don't exactly know, but the point is, there should be no one there. Now, before we get into my thoughts on the ending, especially the time skip scenes, I just wanted to highlight a couple things from Eren's final conversation with Armin that, like I said, took place a day before this final battle. In this finale, he admits that he thought he was doing the rumbling to protect his friends, but because he isn't the mastermind that he might have appeared to be, things still ended up with Sasha and Hanji dying. Also, before he gained Ymir's power, he didn't actually know if any of his friends would survive the war. This led to him admitting that his primary motivation was to destroy everything so we could see this sight of an uninhabited world. By the way, just to clear up any confusion about this line where he says, "I wanted to do that," what he's basically saying here is that he doesn't understand why he's always had the desire to chase freedom, because when we look at the first episode, 99% of people inside the walls were happy to live inside the walls. Like, Eren was very much an outlier, he's a weirdo. Most people were happy with their lives, and it's only people like Eren and Armin who were even curious about what lies beyond the wall. So when Eren says, "I don't know why I wanted to do this," it's just him saying that he doesn't know why this is in his nature. He doesn't know why he's different from most other people. Anyway, the other thing from his conversation with Armin that I thought was worth mentioning was the scene where he says that his head is just a total mess because the effect of the Founding Titan's power means that, from his point of view, there is no past or future. Everything just happens at the same time. A side effect of him experiencing the flow of time in this way is that events that have happened in the past, they have to happen, like he can't change them in any way. And one of those events was the moment where Dinah Fritz eats his mother. In this scene, he admits to Armin that effectively he was the one who made it happen, because as we saw in the very beginning of season 4, there was a moment there where Dinah Fritz could have eaten Bertolt instead. In fact, I think in any other situation, there would have been nothing stopping her. She would have just gone for him, she would have eaten him, and she would have become the new Colossal Titan. However, that obviously would have broken the timeline because everything would have just changed if that had happened. And because of the way Eren experiences things, he was the one who influenced Dinah Fritz and made her walk past him and towards his mother. And by doing that, it sent the whole events of this series in motion and gave Eren the anger he needed to, reach this point. In that way, it could be said that Eren killed his own mother, but the truth is that she probably would have been eaten anyway. If it wasn't Dinah Fritz, it would have been another Titan because, you know, the whole area was infested with titans and her legs were broken, she couldn't have run. So there are just too many factors going on here for us to say Eren is solely responsible, because ultimately she would have been eaten by someone no matter what. Finally, the last thing from this conversation that was worth highlighting is Eren's emotional maturity. And I know that sounds like a joke because he was breaking down, crying and all that stuff, but he is actually being incredibly emotionally mature when we contrast this scene where he reveals his true feelings and this scene where he is essentially lying. In the scene on the left, he tells Armin that he doesn't want Mikasa to forget about him for 10 years at least. Like, that is his true feeling. But when faced with Mikasa for the last time, that's not what he tells her. He tells her to throw the scarf away and forget about him. Now, what this shows is that Eren, despite often acting like a child, he is emotionally mature. Because if he wanted to be selfish, he could have told her the truth that he wants her to keep thinking about him. But he didn't do that. He was doing everything to help Mikasa kill him and to help Mikasa move on after he's dead. And the ability to not think of himself and instead think of the person he loves and how this is all going to impact her after he's gone. That is a very emotionally mature thing because he's putting her feelings above his own. Also, this might be a parallel with Eren's mother because when she was trapped under that house, she told them to run away, but then when they actually left, she said don't go. So the two situations do have some similarities because it's more about protecting the other person, and so it ends up being a nice parallel. Anyways, after Armin and Eren say goodbye to each other, the anime flashes back to the present day where the power of the Titans has now officially disappeared. As a direct consequence of this, the memories that were previously removed by Eren have now returned to everyone, and although we didn't get to see it, he did say goodbye to each of the people who I already mentioned. It's also heavily implied that the past dimension itself has collapsed, which is why we see the vestiges of Erwin, Hanji, and so many other scouts all saying goodbye to Levi, and we also see Sasha saying goodbye to Connie and Jean. Following this, Mikasa decides to bring Eren's head back to the island to give him a proper burial, although how she exactly does that, I mean, Mali has mostly been trampled, so I doubt she could have taken the train back to Liberia, because, you know, the train tracks are probably rubble by now, but I don't know, honestly, let me know in the comments if you have a solid idea for how she got back home, because yeah, I don't really see how she did that. Also, just like Eren wanted, Armin takes responsibility for stopping him, and the whole idea behind this was that, sort of like the Tiber family, Armin and Jean and the rest of them, they would become heroes of the world who stopped Eren from destroying everything. This moment right here was the chance for the ending to go super dark though, because could you imagine if the Malian soldiers had just killed all the Eldians here regardless? I mean, that could have happened, you know, like if we're being realistic, Secretary Muller was the only person who had the authority to decide if the Eldians lived or died here. And, you know, he seems like quite a tolerant person, so he let it slide. But if that was someone else, I think most Malians in that situation would have probably just given the order to massacre the Eldians here, especially after, you know, everything that had happened. But yeah, I mean, they got lucky because Secretary Muller seems to be a really nice guy and he lets them live. And in doing that, they are allowed to become ambassadors 3 years later for the rest of the world. During that 3-year time skip, Eldia becomes a highly militarized country that can't rely on Titans anymore, so their main thing is guns, hence the new flag. And, you know, a lot of people on the island are just going with the flow like Hitch, and it seems like Kiyomi is back on the island and working with the Yeagers, which is that is kind of a big surprise considering how they treated her towards the end. I'm not really sure what her endgame is here exactly, but if we look in the background, it is quite a multicultural alliance standing behind Historia. If I had to guess, this is possible that after Eren did the rumbling and during those 3 years, Historia and Kiyomi have somehow managed to get other nations on their side, because there is a side here. It's Eldia versus everyone else. And I guess if certain countries perceive Eldia as being more prepared in the fight that's about to come, then they might decide to join that alliance with Eldia so that their countries don't get victimized in the future. This theory becomes even more believable when we compare the anime ending to the manga ending, because in the end of the manga, within 3 years, there were certain countries that had pretty much been rebuilt to the way they were before. And the best example of that is this panel right here, where we see Onyankopon seemingly going to work, we see Falco in a turtleneck without any problems in the world, and we see what looks like a very built up modern looking city. Now, when we contrast this with the anime ending, we don't see anything like this, At best, in the outside world, all we see are refugee camps and basically areas of the planet that need to be rebuilt. We don't see anything that looks modern. So if we look at the anime ending only, you would believe that the rest of the world is a lot weaker compared to the island. In fact, during Eren's final conversation with Armin, he says to him, the world outside the walls drops to the same level of civilization as Paradis. Now, he could be referring to population size, but I don't think that's the case. I think what he means is that the remaining tech that exists outside the island, it doesn't surpass what currently exists on Paradis. That would certainly explain why certain countries would want to join forces with the island even after what Eren did, but let me know your thoughts on this in the comments down below. Now, one of the best moments from this timeskip scene that I think was intentional was when Gabby and Falco were planting this tree, because it has a secret meaning that relates to something that Sasha's dad said earlier in the season. Back then, Sasha's dad said that the world is a great big forest where everyone's fighting for their life, and he implied that Sasha was killed because she stayed in that forest for too long. In Gabby's case, he said that it was the responsibility of adults like him to make sure that kids like this stay out of the forest, and he was talking about a metaphorical forest where people kill each other and get killed themselves. And now, 3 years after that, Gabby and Falco are planting a literal forest, having now escaped from that metaphorical forest of violence, thanks to the Titan powers disappearing. Even though it does seem like a little bit of a reach, I do think that this was intentional, because it's just too perfect for them to be planting an actual forest having gone out of the metaphorical forest that he was talking about. I stand by this. I think this was definitely an intentional detail. A couple other details were Yelena crying when she saw the baseball and gloves because it obviously reminds her of Zeke, and Levi handing out candy to the refugee kids. And when he saw this lollipop, it instantly reminded him of his first trip to Mali when he saw the clown. And I guess in this scene he did look a bit sad, and I'm pretty sure the reason for this is that this moment when he first met the clown, it's a time when the scouts were hopeful. They believed that peace was still possible and that they could reach some kind of agreement and understanding with their enemies. And so I think that's what he's reminded of when he looks at this thing, and it's why he kind of like closes his eyes and looks a little bit upset, because naturally things didn't go the peaceful way they wanted them to go at that particular time in their lives. Finally, back on the island, Mikasa was just chilling by Eren's grave, which I imagine she's here quite often, and this was the day that Armin, Annie, and the rest of the Alliance were arriving back to Eldia for the first time in 3 years. What's interesting is that in that time, despite killing Eren, Mikasa still hasn't gotten over his death, and I think this actually serves to make what she did that much more powerful. The fact she was willing to prioritize the rest of the world over him, even though she loves him this deeply, that's the whole reason why Ymir waited 2,000 years to see it. So what Mikasa still being in love with him shows us is that yes, her feelings for him were always real, and her love was so intense that it still persists even after she kills him, even after 3 years, even after decades. She's still in love with him, which only makes her decision to kill him that much more unbelievable. As the episode then comes to an end, a bird swoops down to fix her scarf, which is something that Eren himself had promised to do, to fix her scarf forever. Honestly, this is probably a coincidence, although there is one thing that I would say. Norse mythology has had a huge impact on this series, whether it's the Paths tree, aka the World Tree, whether it's Ymir being the first giant, whether it's the 9 realms and the 9 titans, so there's a lot of parallels here. And one thing that happens in Norse mythology is that Odin, who's essentially, the most powerful character, he has the ability to see the world through his birds. I think they're ravens or crows. He can see the world through their eyes. So based on all the other connections to Norse mythology that exist in this series, I wouldn't say it's impossible that Eren is either controlling this bird or seeing the world through this bird, but I also don't think there's meant to be a 100% definitive answer. Now, moving on to the post-credit scenes, we got to see Shiganshina's evolution over the course of hundreds, if not thousands of years. And if you pause at certain parts, there are major historical events going on and also conclusions to certain characters. For example, the first thing that caught my attention was the arrival of Armin and the rest of the ambassadors as they go to visit Eren's grave, presumably on the day they arrived or not long after that. And this was the final time we saw a bunch of characters. I mean, Connie, Reiner, Peak, Annie, they definitely don't show up in any of the other post-credit scenes. Mikasa and Armin do, and Jean potentially does, but I know this is an area of debate. But this was the final appearance of, at a minimum, 4 major characters, but possibly 5. Following that, a lot of time passes, I would think 10 years at least, and Mikasa shows up to Eren's grave with a man. Now, the anime doesn't really make it clear at all who this man is, but I know a lot of you watching would have seen the manga panel where it does seem from the hairstyle that if it's any character we know, it would probably be Jean. Now, while there is no definitive answer in the anime version, I would say one thing. Jean is the only person, possibly in the world, who would be okay with his wife or girlfriend still being completely obsessed with her dead ex-boyfriend, because ultimately Jean's been there from the beginning. He knows how Mikasa feels about Eren, and I guess he wouldn't expect her to forget him. Whereas any other man, I'm not sure if anyone else would be willing to put up with this constant Eren obsession that never goes away. So for that reason, just because Jean is a bit flexible about the situation, I think, yeah, it probably is him. Like, if we're talking about percentages here, I would say like it's 70% gonna be him. But honestly, if it's a random person like Historia's husband, then that's fine too. But I'm just saying what I think is the most likely scenario. Decades later, we then see that Shiganshina is a lot more built up, and they do have cars on the island now, and Mikasa, an old version of Mikasa, visits Eren's grave with her extended family. Now, after zooming in closely on this, we see what is probably Mikasa's adult daughter and 1 grandchild, and over here we see a couple who, I assume at least one of these 2 people are one of Mikasa's kids. Whether it's the guy or the girl, we have absolutely no clue, but they do have 3 kids, so that's 2 daughters on the left and 1 son on the right. And if this really is Mikasa and Jean as a couple over here, then collectively they have 4 grandkids, 2 grandsons and 2 granddaughters. Sometime after this, Mikasa then dies, but regardless of what she died from, the fact is that she lived a long, full life just like Eren asked her to do. But what she didn't do is throw the scarf away. She held onto it for her entire life and in death. By now, you'd think she'd at least have like a second scarf, maybe one with a horse on it or something like that. But no, I guess till the end, she really did just care about Eren. And I guess whatever her and her new husband had, it just could never eclipse how she felt for him. What follows this is a bunch of super fast moving scenes, one of which includes Armin visiting the grave as an old man. And I'm pretty sure this is Armin. Like, he's old, he's got the blonde hair. Who else is this gonna be? Reiner? Nah, this is Armin for sure. Also, right after Armin appears, we see these kids racing each other towards the tree on the hill, which I guess is meant to be like a proper full circle moment. Like, it's just meant to be a nice touch. As the years then go by, Shiganshina becomes a super industrial place, and it progresses so amazingly that it actually catches up with our modern civilization. What I never expected though was that the anime would show things advancing beyond that point, because in the manga version, the island basically reached our modern civilization and then got destroyed. But here, it goes so far beyond that. Like, this is pretty much sci-fi. In fact, one of my favorite shows right now, besides anime and stuff, one of my favorite shows is a show called Foundation, which is set like tens of thousands of years in the future when humans have like moved out into other solar systems and have pretty much forgotten that they came from Earth. And this city that I see right here in Shiganshina, it's easily a city that could exist in that show. Like, things have progressed this far. This sci-fi looking city was so far in the future that even though it does get nuked in the end, we can't honestly say that this is because of the rumbling. There is an unbelievable amount of world events that could have happened in between this point and this point. So many things that would be more fresh in the mind of the people who were living in this sci-fi world. I honestly don't think we can say this is because of the rumbling. I think it's just meant to show that the cycle of violence, it will continue no matter what. Because like Irvin said, humans will always have conflicts with each other until there's only one person left. Anyhow, sometime after Shiganshina gets nuked into oblivion, there is this moment where we see a young boy who's clearly on a journey with his dog, and it looks like he knows where he's going. Like, he's not just wandering aimlessly. He knows he's looking for the tree on the hill where Eren was buried. And that made me wonder a little bit, like, is there a story here? Like, why is he seeking out this tree, which is now, after all these years, it's basically become the original tree that Ymir fell into. It looks basically exactly the same. And there are a couple implications of this. For example, did the source of all living matter somehow survive? Like, was there a piece of it inside of Eren's head, potentially? It is interesting to think about because, like Zeke was saying, life always finds a way to adapt and survive. And this tree is testament to that. Somehow, the source of all living matter, or something like that, has somehow managed to restart this whole thing again. What's nice about this situation, though, is that unlike Ymir, who was being chased by dogs and only ran into the tree because she needed a place to hide from being killed, this boy is obviously a lot different. He's seeking out the tree. He's looking for it. It kind of makes me think that even if him and the dog do fall down into there, and even if they were to gain some kind of power, it might not be a destructive power like the Titans, because Ymir, the whole reason why she became a Titan was because she wanted to escape death. That's the way Zeke put it. She was trying to escape death and was given an immortal body that helped her live forever. This boy's intentions, I would imagine, are slightly different from that. I doubt he's trying to escape death. So the power that he might end up with, it might not be exactly the same. Overall, I do like this ending. It is quite open-ended, but at the same time, you feel like you've been told everything you need to know. Like, we don't actually need to see this boy transforming or anything like that. So it was a really good way to wrap up the series. In terms of my thoughts on this series as a whole, I mean, obviously I wouldn't have made 100 videos on Attack on Titan if I didn't already love Attack on Titan. So even if this ending was trash, which it wasn't, it wouldn't have changed my thoughts on the overall series. This is a series that is a masterpiece. I mean, I think from season 1, the best thing about this was the mystery. He hid information from us in a genius way where every time something was revealed, it was shocking, but then it made sense. And as we progressed further and further, and we learned more and more about royal blood and Marley and Grisha's true identity and all these other things, it all fits together like a perfect puzzle. And this final episode was that last piece, and it does feel incredibly satisfying now that that piece has been put in its place and the puzzle is complete. However, my biggest criticism of the series is that given that the ending is so heavily dependent on Mikasa's love for Eren and Eren's love for Mikasa, it only makes sense that it should have been developed more than it was, because I think in retrospect we can say that it was always obvious that she liked him, but at certain points I also felt like she thought she was his mother or his sister. She acted a lot like that on certain occasions, so it wasn't 100% clear that there was a romantic connection there. And I think that's the one thing that could have been improved. If there was just a few more scenes of them having that spark or chemistry, that would have really sold the ending, but it is what it is. By the way, if you've made it this far, then don't forget that my updated version of the alternate timeline will be dropping relatively soon, probably within the next 1 or 2 weeks, so if you don't want to miss it, then remember to subscribe with notifications on. Just before we end the video, don't forget to download War Thunder for free by clicking my link in the description, and you'll get 100,000 silver, a 50% booster in your rewards, a body pillow decoration, and other perks for an entire week.